I'm Debbie Ricketts, and I'm 81 years old. What I'm about to tell you happened to me in 1963, when I was just 28 years old, living in Bozeman, Montana. A week before I was supposed to walk down the aisle to marry the love of my life, my own twin brother, the person I trusted more than anyone else in this world, drugged my coffee, threw me in the back of his pickup truck, and drove me 20 miles out into the Montana wilderness to an abandoned hunting cabin where he tied my hands and feet to an old wooden chair with rope so tight it cut into my skin. I sat there in that freezing cold cabin for 3 days, watching my brother pace back and forth like a caged animal, his eyes wild with something I'd never seen before. He kept saying I was ruining everything, that I was destroying our family, that he couldn't let me marry John. The worst part wasn't the cold or the hunger or even the fear. It was looking into the face of someone who shared my DNA, who I'd played with as children, who knew all my secrets, and seeing a complete stranger staring back at me. I thought I was going to die in that cabin. I thought I'd never see my fiancé John again, never feel my mother's arms around me, never get to wear that white dress hanging in my closet back home. But then something happened that I can only call a miracle. Something so unexpected that even now, all these decades later, it still takes my breath away. And if you stay with me, I'll tell you exactly how a gruff old mechanic named Sam Wheeler became the answer to my prayers and saved my life when my own flesh and blood tried to destroy it. You see, back in 1963, Bozeman was still a small town where everybody knew everybody else's business. My wedding dress was hanging in my bedroom closet, a simple ivory silk gown that had belonged to my grandmother. I'd tried it on just 2 days before Henry took me, adjusting the hem one last time, dreaming about walking down the aisle of First Methodist Church where 3 generations of my family had been married. Henry and I had been inseparable our whole lives. We came into this world together, learned to walk together, started school together. After our father died when we were 16, we leaned on each other even more. I never saw this coming. I never imagined that the boy who used to braid my hair and share his Halloween candy with me would become the man who would try to steal my future. But here's what I learned during those 3 terrible days tied up in that cabin. Sometimes the people you think you know best are the ones carrying the heaviest secrets. And sometimes, when everything falls apart, help comes from places you never expected. Sam Wheeler was a man I'd probably spoken to maybe 10 times in my entire life. Just quick hellos when I'd drive past his garage on Main Street. He had grease under his fingernails, wore the same denim coveralls every day, and most folks in town thought he was just a quiet loner who preferred engines to people. They were wrong about Sam Wheeler. Dead wrong. And I'm only alive today because of what he did for a desperate mother and her missing daughter during the worst week of our lives. If you can, please leave in the comments where you're watching this old lady from. It warms my heart to know that my voice is reaching far, maybe even places I never had the chance to visit. And if you like my story, please leave a like and subscribe to Grandparents Archives. It helps us to keep sharing meaningful stories like this. Let me take you back to who I was before all this happened. In 1963, I was 28 years old, which back then meant most people thought I was getting close to being an old maid. I'd been working as a secretary at the county courthouse for 6 years, living with my mother Ellen in the same house where Henry and I grew up on Olive Street. It was a modest 2-story home with a front porch that needed painting and a garden where my mother grew the best tomatoes in Bozeman. John Mitchell was a teacher at the elementary school, 7 years older than me, with kind eyes and hands that were always gentle when he touched my face. We'd been courting for 2 years, and when he finally proposed on Christmas Eve of 1962, I thought my heart might burst right out of my chest. He wasn't the most handsome man in town, and he certainly wasn't the richest, but he made me laugh, and he listened when I talked about my dreams of maybe traveling someday, maybe seeing the ocean. Henry worked construction then, building houses for the families moving to Bozeman as the town slowly grew. He was stronger than me, had always been stronger, even though we were born just 12 minutes apart. People used to say we had our own language when we were little. We'd look at each other across a room and somehow know exactly what the other was thinking. He was my other half, my constant companion. But looking back now, I can see the signs I missed. The way Henry's jaw would tighten when John would pick me up for dates. How he'd suddenly find reasons to leave the room when John and I would sit on the porch talking about our wedding plans. The way he'd change the subject whenever anyone asked if he was seeing anyone special. I thought he was just being protective, the way older brothers are supposed to be, even though he was only 12 minutes older. I thought he was happy for me. I was wrong about so many things back then. Our father, Robert Ricketts, died of a heart attack when Henry and I were 16. He was loading hay bales on the Jameson Ranch just outside town when he collapsed. The doctor said it was quick, that he probably didn't suffer, but that didn't make the hole in our lives any smaller. Mother had to take in sewing to make ends meet, hemming dresses and mending work clothes for the other families in town. I'd sit with her in the evenings, learning her stitches, listening to her hum old hymns while we worked by lamplight. Henry took Dad's death harder than I did, even though we never talked much about it. He started staying out later, coming home with skinned knuckles and dirt on his clothes. Mother would ask him where he'd been, and he'd just shrug and head upstairs to his room. I'd hear him moving around up there sometimes late at night, pacing across the old floorboards that creaked with every step. I kept going to church every Sunday at First Methodist, sitting in the same pew where our family had sat for as long as I could remember. I believed then that God had a plan for everyone, that even losing Dad was part of something bigger I couldn't understand yet. Henry stopped coming to church after the funeral. When Mother asked him why, he said he was done listening to stories about a God who takes fathers away from their children. The winter before I got engaged to John, I started noticing changes in Henry that worried me. He'd snap at Mother over little things, like if dinner was 10 minutes late, or if she asked him to help with chores around the house. He started drinking beer after work, sitting on the back steps even when it was cold enough to see your breath. When I'd try to talk to him about it, he'd look at me like I was a stranger who had no business asking questions about his life. Mother pulled me aside one evening while Henry was out. She was mending a tear in one of his work shirts, and her hands were shaking slightly as she threaded her needle. She said she was worried about him, that he seemed angry all the time about things that had nothing to do with us. She asked if I'd noticed it too. I had noticed, but I told myself it was just Henry growing up, becoming a man, dealing with responsibilities that felt too heavy for someone who was still so young. Planning a wedding in a small town like Bozeman meant everyone had an opinion about everything. Mrs. Patterson from the flower shop kept insisting I needed white roses instead of the yellow ones I'd picked out. The ladies from church volunteered to make the reception food, which meant hours of discussions about whether to serve ham or roast beef, and should there be green beans or corn, and what about dessert besides the wedding cake. I was trying on my grandmother's dress for the final fitting when Mother mentioned that Henry hadn't said whether he was bringing anyone to the wedding. I'd asked him about it twice, and both times he'd just shrugged and said he'd figure it out. When I suggested he might ask Mary Louise from the bank, who I'd seen him talking to after church a few months back, he got that look on his face again. The one that made me feel like I'd said something wrong without knowing what it was. John asked Henry to be his best man, which seemed natural since Henry was going to be his brother-in-law. Henry said yes, but he never seemed excited about it. When John would stop by the house to discuss the ceremony details, Henry would find reasons to be somewhere else. He'd remember suddenly that he needed to check on something at the construction site, or he'd decide that was the perfect time to chop firewood, even though we already had enough split logs to last through the next winter. The week before the wedding, Henry started coming home even later from work. Mother would keep his dinner warm in the oven, and I'd hear him finally come in around 9 or 10 o'clock, eating alone at the kitchen table while the rest of the house was quiet. When I'd try to talk to him about the rehearsal dinner or ask if he'd written his best man speech, he'd give me one-word answers or just grunt and keep eating. Mother said she thought Henry might be feeling left behind, that maybe he was realizing his twin sister was about to start a whole new life that wouldn't include him the way it always had. She suggested I talk to him, really talk to him, about how much he meant to me and how marriage wouldn't change the fact that he was my brother and my friend. I tried. 3 days before the wedding, I knocked on his bedroom door and asked if I could come in. He was lying on his bed, still in his work clothes, staring up at the ceiling. I sat on the edge of his bed the way I used to when we were kids, and I told him I was scared about getting married, about changing, about whether John and I would be happy together. I asked him if he thought I was making the right choice. He turned his head to look at me, and for just a moment, I saw something in his eyes that reminded me of the little boy who used to comfort me during thunderstorms. But then he sat up and said he was tired, that he had to get up early for work, and maybe we could talk about it later. Later never came. It was Tuesday evening, exactly 1 week before my wedding day. I was in the kitchen washing dishes after dinner when Henry came in through the back door. He seemed different somehow, calmer than he'd been in weeks, almost cheerful. He said he had something special to show me, a wedding present he'd been working on in secret. He wanted to take me to see it right then, before it got too late. I should have known something was wrong. Henry had never been the type to make surprises or give gifts that required special trips. But I was so relieved to see him acting normal again, to hear him talking about the wedding like it was something good instead of something he was trying to avoid. I dried my hands on the dish towel and grabbed my coat. Mother was upstairs taking a bath, and I called up to tell her I was going with Henry to see something. She called back that she'd see me later, and I heard her humming one of her hymns through the bathroom door. That was the last normal moment I had for 3 days. Henry drove his pickup truck down roads I'd never seen before, winding through pine forests and past fields that seemed to stretch on forever in the darkness. I asked him where we were going, and he said it was a surprise that I'd see soon enough. The heater in his truck barely worked, and I pulled my coat tighter around me as we drove further and further from town. When we finally stopped, we were in front of a small wooden cabin that looked like it hadn't been used in years. There were no other lights anywhere, no other houses, nothing but trees and darkness in every direction. Henry said his friend Charlie used to bring his family here for hunting trips, but Charlie had moved to Billings and told Henry he could use the place whenever he wanted. I followed Henry up to the cabin door, still thinking he was going to show me some kind of gift inside. Maybe he'd been carving something for John and me, or maybe he'd found some old family photos I'd never seen before. The door wasn't locked, and when he pushed it open, I could smell musty air and old wood and something else I couldn't identify. That's when Henry grabbed my arm and shoved me inside. Before I could turn around or ask him what he was doing, everything went black. I woke up hours later with my head pounding and my wrists tied so tight behind my back that my fingers were going numb. My ankles were bound to the legs of an old wooden chair, and there was a gag in my mouth that tasted like motor oil and dirt. Henry was sitting across from me in another chair, just watching me. When he saw I was awake, he leaned forward and said, "I'm sorry, Debbie, but I couldn't let you do it. I couldn't let you marry him and ruin everything we have." I tried to talk, tried to ask him what he meant, but the gag made it impossible to form words. I could only make muffled sounds that seemed to echo around the small cabin. Henry got up and started pacing back and forth in front of me, running his hands through his hair the way he used to do when we were children, and he was trying to solve a problem he couldn't figure out. He said John was going to take me away from him, that once I was married I'd forget about my family, forget about the people who really loved me. He said he'd watched it happen to other families, sisters and brothers who used to be close until marriage came along and broke everything apart. He couldn't stand the thought of losing me to someone who'd only known me for 2 years when he'd known me his whole life. I stared at my twin brother, the person I'd shared a womb with, the person who knew all my secrets and fears, and I realized I didn't know him at all. This wasn't the Henry who used to braid my hair and share his candy. This wasn't the Henry who held my hand at Dad's funeral and promised we'd always take care of each other. This was someone else wearing my brother's face, someone whose love had turned into something twisted and dangerous. Henry kept me tied to that chair for what felt like forever, talking at me like I was supposed to understand his reasoning. He'd removed the gag after the first few hours, but only because he wanted me to listen to him explain why he'd done this terrible thing. He said I'd always been the lucky one, the one everyone loved more, the one who got all the attention. When we were babies, people would coo over me first, and then remember Henry was there too. When we started school, I made friends easily while Henry had to work harder to get people to notice him. He said it got worse after Dad died. Everyone in town would ask me how I was doing, pat my shoulder, tell me what a sweet girl I was, and how proud Dad would be of the woman I was becoming. But Henry said people looked at him differently, like they expected him to be the man of the house now, like being 16 years old somehow made him responsible for taking care of everyone. Nobody asked how he was feeling or whether he needed comfort too. And then John came along, and Henry said he could see it happening all over again. John would light up when he saw me, bring me flowers, hold doors for me, treat me like I was something precious. Henry said he'd never had anyone look at him that way, never had anyone choose him first or think he was special enough to build a life around. While he talked, I kept working my wrists against the ropes, trying to loosen them even a little bit. The chair I was tied to was old and rickety, probably left behind by whoever used to hunt in this cabin. I could feel a nail sticking out slightly from the wooden armrest, and every time Henry would turn away or get distracted by his own rambling, I'd try to work the rope against that sharp edge. My fingers were so cold I could barely feel them, and the rope was cutting into my skin every time I moved. But I kept thinking about my wedding dress hanging in my closet, about John waiting for me back home, about my mother who must be worried sick by now. I wasn't going to let Henry steal my future because he was jealous of something he could have for himself if he'd just try. Back in Bozeman, I found out later, John had come by the house Wednesday morning to discuss some last-minute details about the ceremony. When Mother told him I'd gone somewhere with Henry the night before and hadn't come home, John said he felt something cold settle in his stomach. I'd never stayed out all night in my life, never gone anywhere without telling Mother exactly where I'd be and when I'd be back. John went to the construction site where Henry worked, but Henry's supervisor said he hadn't shown up for work that morning. That's when John knew something was seriously wrong. He drove straight to the sheriff's office and told Sheriff Martinez that his fiancée was missing and he suspected her brother might know where she was. Sheriff Martinez knew our family. He'd been friends with our father and had watched Henry and me grow up. He said it was probably just pre-wedding nerves, that maybe I'd gotten scared and asked Henry to take me somewhere quiet so I could think. Young women sometimes got overwhelmed right before their weddings, he said. They'd give it another day or two before they started a real search. But John wouldn't accept that answer. He drove all over Bozeman, asking everyone he could find if they'd seen Henry's pickup truck or knew where he might take me. He checked every place we'd ever gone as children, our old fishing spot by the creek, the meadow where we used to pick wildflowers, the abandoned barn where we'd played hide and seek. Nothing. Meanwhile, in that freezing cabin, Henry was telling me his plan. He was going to keep me there until Saturday passed, until my wedding day came and went without a bride. He figured John would eventually give up and find someone else to marry, and I'd come to my senses and realize that family was more important than romance. He actually believed I'd thank him someday for saving me from making what he called the biggest mistake of my life. I told him he was crazy, that what he was doing was kidnapping, that people would be looking for me. He laughed and said nobody would think to look for me way out here, that Charlie's cabin was so far from any main roads that even if search parties started looking, they'd never find this place. He said by the time anyone discovered what he'd done, it would be too late to change anything back. That's when I realized Henry wasn't planning to let me go, even after my wedding day passed. He was planning to keep me here until I agreed to see things his way, until I promised to give up John and go back to being just his twin sister and nothing more. He was planning to hold me prisoner until I became the person he wanted me to be instead of the person I actually was. By Thursday morning, I'd managed to work that rusty nail loose enough that I could feel the rope starting to fray where it rubbed against the metal. My wrists were raw and bleeding, but I kept at it every time Henry would leave the cabin to get firewood or use the outhouse behind the building. He'd started rationing the food he'd brought, some crackers, a few cans of beans, a thermos of coffee that had gone cold the first night. He said he hadn't planned on staying this long, that he'd thought I'd come around to his way of thinking faster than this. I prayed constantly during those hours alone. Not the formal prayers I'd learned in Sunday school, but desperate conversations with God that came from somewhere deeper than words. I asked for strength to keep working at those ropes. I asked for wisdom to know what to say to Henry that might reach whatever was left of my real brother inside this stranger. Mostly, I asked for someone to find me before it was too late. Henry had stopped trying to explain himself and started getting angry when I wouldn't agree with him. He'd pace around the cabin, kicking at the dust on the floor, muttering about how stubborn I was being and how I'd always been too proud for my own good. Sometimes he'd look at me like he was seeing me for the first time, like he was surprised to find me there tied to that chair. Those moments scared me more than his anger did. Back in Bozeman, my mother had taken matters into her own hands. When John came by Thursday afternoon to tell her the sheriff still wasn't taking my disappearance seriously, Mother put on her coat and said they were going to search Henry's room together. She'd raised 2 children, she told John, and she knew when one of them was lying about something important. Mother found what she was looking for in Henry's sock drawer, a hand-drawn map showing roads that led out of town toward the mountains. There were several X marks on the map, and one of them had a note written beside it that said Charlie's Place, Hunting Cabin. Mother had never heard Henry mention anyone named Charlie, but she remembered that he'd been spending time with some of the men from the lumber mill after work, men who talked about hunting and fishing in places most people didn't know about. She and John drove to the lumber mill and found Charlie Brennan just as he was finishing his shift. When they described Henry and asked about a cabin, Charlie's face went pale. He said he'd told Henry he could use his family's old hunting cabin anytime he wanted, but he never thought Henry would actually take him up on it. The cabin was way out in the wilderness, Charlie said, at least 20 miles from the nearest neighbor. Charlie drew them a better map, showing exactly which logging roads to take and where to turn off the main highway. He said the cabin was in rough shape, no electricity, no phone, just a stone fireplace and some old furniture that had been left there for years. It wasn't the kind of place you'd take someone unless you wanted to make sure nobody could find them. Mother and John drove out there that evening, following Charlie's directions as carefully as they could. But when they got to where the cabin was supposed to be, they couldn't find it in the darkness. The logging roads all looked the same, and without daylight to see the landmarks Charlie had described, they kept taking wrong turns and ending up at dead ends or clearings that led nowhere. They drove around for hours, calling my name into the darkness, honking the horn of John's car, hoping I might hear them and find a way to signal back. But the forest swallowed up their voices, and there was no response except the wind moving through the pine trees and the sound of their own footsteps when they'd stop to walk around and search. Finally, John's car started overheating from all the rough driving on those mountain roads. Steam was pouring out from under the hood, and they realized they'd have to head back to town and try again in the morning with better preparation. Mother cried during the whole drive home, not the quiet tears she'd shed at Dad's funeral, but the kind of crying that comes from a place of pure fear and helplessness. Meanwhile, I'd managed to get one hand almost completely free. The rope was still wrapped around my wrist, but I could move my fingers and bend my arms slightly. I was working on the knots that held my ankles to the chair legs when Henry came back inside from gathering more firewood. He looked at me suspiciously, like he could sense something had changed, but the cabin was so dark that he couldn't see what I'd accomplished. He sat down across from me again and said he'd been thinking about what would happen after my wedding day passed. He said maybe we could stay at the cabin for a while longer, just the 2 of us, like a camping trip we used to take with Dad when we were children. He said it felt good to have me all to himself again, without John or Mother or anyone else trying to come between us. That's when I knew for certain that Henry had no intention of ever letting me go home. Friday morning, Mother and John set out again with a better plan and more supplies. John had borrowed a more reliable truck from his friend at the school, and Mother had packed sandwiches and a thermos of hot coffee. They also brought Sheriff Martinez's deputy, Tom Fletcher, who'd finally agreed that 3 days was too long for someone like me to be missing without word. They were about 5 miles out of town on the main highway when John's borrowed truck started making a grinding noise and began to slow down. Black smoke was coming from the engine, and John had to pull over to the side of the road before the whole thing seized up completely. Deputy Fletcher tried his radio, but they were too far from town to get a clear signal to call for help. They sat there for almost an hour, watching every car that passed and hoping someone would stop to help them. Most people just drove by, probably figuring they'd work out their own problems, or that someone else would stop eventually. Mother was getting more and more frantic with every minute that passed, knowing I was out there somewhere, and that every delay meant I was in danger longer. Then Sam Wheeler's beat-up work truck came rattling down the highway. Sam was heading back to town after delivering a repaired engine to a ranch about 10 miles out. He probably would have driven right past them like everyone else, but he recognized John from around town and saw Mother sitting in the passenger seat, looking like the world was ending. Sam pulled over and got out to look under the hood of John's truck. He was wearing his usual coveralls and had grease stains on his hands that looked like they'd been there for years. He didn't say much while he poked around the engine, just grunted and shook his head a few times. Finally, he stood up and wiped his hands on a rag and told them the truck wasn't going anywhere without major repairs. Mother started crying again then, not quietly but in big, shaking sobs that seemed to surprise Sam. He asked what was so important that they needed to be somewhere right away, and Mother told him the whole story. About me disappearing, about finding the map in Henry's room, about spending the night before driving around in circles looking for a cabin they couldn't find. Sam listened without interrupting, his weathered face showing no expression at all. When Mother finished talking, he was quiet for so long that John started to ask if he knew anything about Charlie Brennan's hunting cabin. But before John could finish his question, Sam said he knew exactly where that cabin was, and he could take them there right now if they wanted. It turned out Sam had been hunting and fishing in those mountains since he was a boy. His father had been a guide for rich men who came out from the cities to shoot elk and catch trout, and Sam had grown up learning every logging road and deer trail in a 50-mile radius around Bozeman. He said Charlie's cabin was tucked back in a spot where most people would never think to look, but Sam had passed by it dozens of times over the years. Deputy Fletcher radioed back to town to let Sheriff Martinez know what was happening, and then all 4 of them climbed into Sam's truck. It was cramped and smelled like motor oil and old coffee, but Mother didn't complain about anything. She just held on to John's hand and stared out the window like she was trying to will me to be safe through pure determination. Sam drove those mountain roads like he'd been born on them, taking turns I'm sure the other 3 couldn't even see coming. He knew which bridges were strong enough to hold the weight of his truck, and which creek crossings were too deep after the spring thaw. He didn't talk much during the drive, just pointed out landmarks occasionally, and told them how much farther they had to go. Meanwhile, back at the cabin, I'd finally worked my left hand completely free from the ropes. The circulation was starting to come back to my fingers, and I could feel the cuts on my wrists stinging as blood began to flow normally again. I was working on the knots around my ankles when I heard Henry's footsteps coming back toward the cabin. I quickly put my hand back behind the chair and tried to make the loose rope look like it was still tight around my wrist. Henry came inside carrying an armload of firewood and seemed to be in a strange mood. Not angry like he'd been the day before, but almost cheerful, like he was enjoying some private joke. He started building up the fire in the old stone fireplace and said he'd been thinking about all the times we used to go camping with Dad when we were kids. He said this felt like those old trips, just the 2 of us spending time together without any outside distractions. He said maybe after this was all over we could do it more often, find quiet places where we could be brother and sister without anyone else interfering. I realized then that Henry was living in some kind of fantasy where what he'd done to me was actually a good thing, where kidnapping me and tying me up was just his way of protecting our special relationship. He'd convinced himself that I'd eventually see things his way and thank him for saving me from a marriage that would have ruined everything between us. But I could hear something in the distance that Henry couldn't hear yet. The faint sound of a truck engine working its way up the mountain roads, getting closer to our isolated cabin with every passing minute. The sound of that truck engine got louder and closer, and I could tell Henry was starting to hear it too. He stopped talking about our childhood camping trips and cocked his head to one side, listening. Then he walked over to the small, dirty window and peered out through the glass. I saw his whole body go rigid when he spotted Sam's truck making its way up the narrow dirt road that led to the cabin. Henry spun around and looked at me with an expression I'd never seen before. Not anger or jealousy, but pure panic. He said someone was coming, that this wasn't supposed to happen, that nobody should have been able to find this place. He started pacing again, but faster this time, running his hands through his hair and muttering things I couldn't understand. I took advantage of his distraction to work my feet completely free from the ropes around my ankles. The feeling of being able to move my legs again was almost overwhelming, like waking up from a nightmare where you've been paralyzed. I could hear voices outside now. Mother's voice calling Henry's name, and a man's voice I didn't recognize telling her to be careful. Henry heard them too, and he rushed over to me and grabbed my arm, trying to pull me up from the chair. He said we had to leave, that there was a back door to the cabin, and we could disappear into the woods before anyone found us. But when I stood up, my legs were so weak from being tied up for 3 days that I stumbled and nearly fell. That's when Henry realized the ropes around my wrists were loose. He looked down at my hands, saw the frayed rope and the blood on my wrists from where I'd worked against that rusty nail, and something changed in his face. The panic turned into something darker, something that made me understand for the first time that my twin brother might actually hurt me to keep me from leaving him. He grabbed both my arms and shook me, saying I'd ruined everything, that I should have just listened to him and accepted what he was trying to do for us. He said if I'd been smarter, if I'd understood how much he loved me, none of this would have been necessary. Now people were going to take me away from him, and it was all my fault for not appreciating what he'd sacrificed to keep us together. Then I heard Mother's voice right outside the cabin door, loud and clear and more angry than I'd ever heard her in my entire life. She was calling Henry's full name, Henry Robert Ricketts, the way she used to when we were children and one of us was in serious trouble. She told him to open the door right now and let her see her daughter, or she was going to have every law enforcement officer in Montana looking for him. Henry let go of my arms and backed away from me, staring at the door like it might explode. I could hear other voices out there too, John calling my name, asking if I was all right, and that unfamiliar man's voice telling everyone to stay calm and let him handle this. The door wasn't locked, and after a few seconds it creaked open. Mother stepped inside first, and when she saw me standing there with rope burns on my wrists and 3 days of dirt and fear on my face, she made a sound that was part sob and part rage. Behind her came John, looking like he'd aged 10 years since I'd last seen him, and a man I'd seen around town but never really talked to, Sam Wheeler from the garage on Main Street. Henry was pressed against the far wall of the cabin, as far from the door as he could get. When Mother looked at him, really looked at him, I saw her face change from relief at finding me to a kind of disappointment I'd never seen before. She asked him how he could do this to his own sister, how he could take away the most important week of my life and tie me up like an animal. Henry started trying to explain, talking fast about how he was protecting me and how marriage would ruin our family, and how nobody understood what it was like to lose the most important person in your life. But Mother cut him off. She said she'd lost her husband and managed to keep living without destroying other people's happiness. She said she'd raised him better than this, that his father would be ashamed of what he'd become. That's when Henry broke. He started crying, not the way men usually cry when they're trying to stay in control, but like a child who's been caught doing something terrible and doesn't know how to fix it. He said he was sorry, that he hadn't meant for it to go this far, that he'd just wanted things to stay the way they used to be when we were kids. But I could see in his eyes that he still wasn't really sorry for what he'd done to me. He was sorry he'd been caught, sorry that his plan hadn't worked, sorry that everyone was looking at him like he was a stranger. He still believed, somewhere deep inside, that kidnapping me had been an act of love instead of an act of violence. Sam Wheeler stepped between Henry and the rest of us then, not saying anything, just positioning himself so that Henry couldn't get to me or Mother or John if he decided to do something desperate. Sam was a big man, with hands that were strong from years of working on engines, and even though he was probably 20 years older than Henry, I could tell Henry wasn't going to try to get past him. I walked toward Mother on legs that still felt unsteady, and when she put her arms around me, I finally let myself cry for everything that had happened. For the brother I'd lost, for the trust that had been broken, for the 3 days of terror and the knowledge that someone I loved had been willing to destroy my life to keep me for himself. But I was alive and I was free, and the people who really loved me had found a way to bring me home. Sheriff Martinez arrived at the cabin about an hour after we did, along with 2 other deputies, and an ambulance that had to park almost a mile away because the road was too narrow for it to get any closer. They checked me over for injuries, cleaned the cuts on my wrists, and wrapped them in clean bandages. The paramedic said I was dehydrated and probably in shock, but that I'd be fine with some rest and proper food. Henry didn't resist when they put the handcuffs on him. He just stood there looking confused, like he couldn't understand how helping his sister had somehow turned into a crime. When Sheriff Martinez read him his rights and explained that he was being arrested for kidnapping, Henry looked at me like he expected me to tell them it was all a misunderstanding, that I'd explained to everyone that he'd only been trying to protect me. I couldn't look at him. Not because I was angry, though I was, but because looking at Henry felt like looking at someone who'd died. The brother I'd grown up with, the boy who'd shared every secret and every dream with me, was gone. This person wearing his face was a stranger who'd been willing to steal my life because he thought he owned me. The ride back to town felt like it took forever. I sat between Mother and John in the back of Sam Wheeler's truck, and none of us talked much. What was there to say? That everything was going to be all right? That Henry would get help and somehow become the brother I remembered? That my wedding could go on as planned like nothing had happened? When we got back to the house on Olive Street, I went straight to my room and saw my wedding dress still hanging in the closet exactly where I'd left it. The sight of it made me start crying again, not tears of relief this time, but tears of grief for everything that had been lost. How could I put on that dress and walk down the aisle knowing that my own brother had tried to stop me from having the life I wanted? Mother came into my room later that evening after John had gone home and Sam had driven back to his garage. She sat on the edge of my bed like she used to when I was a child and had nightmares, and she said something I've never forgotten. She said love without respect isn't really love at all. It's just possession dressed up to look like caring. She said Henry had confused loving me with owning me, and that kind of confusion can turn even the deepest affection into something dangerous. I asked her if she thought Henry was sick, if maybe there was something wrong with his mind that made him think kidnapping me was an acceptable thing to do. Mother was quiet for a long time before she answered. She said she didn't know whether Henry was sick or just selfish, but that it didn't matter. Either way, he'd made a choice to hurt me, and choices have consequences regardless of the reasons behind them. The next few days were a blur of police statements and lawyer meetings and phone calls from relatives who'd heard about what happened. The whole town was talking about it, of course. In a place as small as Bozeman, you can't keep something like this quiet. People would stop talking when I walked into the grocery store or the post office, then start whispering again as soon as I passed by. Some people were sympathetic, bringing casseroles and offering to help with anything I needed. Others seemed to think there must have been more to the story, that maybe I'd done something to provoke Henry, or that families should handle their problems privately instead of involving the law. A few people even suggested that maybe Henry had been right to be concerned about my relationship with John, that perhaps there were things they didn't understand about the situation. Those comments hurt almost as much as what Henry had done to me. The idea that anyone could think I deserved to be kidnapped, that my brother's jealousy was somehow justified, made me feel like I was living in a world where nothing was safe or predictable anymore. John came by every day, bringing flowers or books, or just sitting with me while I tried to make sense of what had happened. He never pressured me to talk about the wedding or make decisions about whether we should postpone it or cancel it entirely. He just waited, patient and steady, letting me know that whatever I decided would be all right with him. But I could see the worry in his eyes. Not just worry about me, but worry about us, about whether what Henry had done would change how I felt about getting married, about starting a new life that might take me away from the family I'd always known. John was afraid that Henry's twisted logic might have planted seeds of doubt in my mind, that maybe I'd start to wonder if marriage really was a betrayal of the people who'd loved me first. The truth was, I did wonder about that. Not because I thought Henry was right, but because I couldn't stop thinking about how completely I'd misunderstood someone I thought I knew better than anyone else in the world. If I could be so wrong about my own twin brother, how could I trust my judgment about anything else? How could I be sure that marrying John was the right choice when my ability to read people had failed me so completely? I'm 81 years old now, and I can tell you that those doubts were normal. When someone you trust betrays you that deeply, it makes you question everything you thought you knew about love and family and your own ability to make good decisions. But doubting yourself and letting fear control your choices are two different things entirely. I made the decision to go ahead with the wedding on Thursday morning, exactly 1 week after Henry had taken me to that cabin. I was sitting in the kitchen drinking coffee and watching Mother hem a dress for Mrs. Patterson when it hit me that I wasn't going to let Henry steal this from me too. He'd already taken my sense of safety, my trust in family, and my belief that love was always a good thing. I wasn't going to give him my wedding day as well. John cried when I told him. Not sad tears, but relief tears, the kind that come when you've been holding your breath for so long you'd forgotten what normal breathing felt like. He said he'd been afraid I'd want to wait, maybe postpone the wedding for months, or even years while I tried to make sense of what Henry had done. But I told him waiting wouldn't change anything that had already happened, and it wouldn't make Henry's betrayal hurt any less. The wedding was smaller than we'd originally planned. Some of the relatives who were supposed to come from out of town decided to stay home rather than be part of what they probably saw as a family scandal. A few of our friends seemed uncomfortable about celebrating anything so soon after such a terrible event. But the people who mattered most were there, and that was enough. Mother spent the morning of the wedding helping me get ready, just like we'd always planned. She did my hair in the style we'd practiced, pinning small white flowers from our garden behind my ear. When I put on my grandmother's dress, it fit perfectly, as if it had been waiting all these years for me to need its strength and beauty. The bruises on my wrists had faded to yellow and green, but they were still visible. Mother suggested I wear long gloves to cover them, but I decided against it. Those marks were part of my story now, part of what had brought me to this moment. Hiding them would have felt like pretending Henry's betrayal hadn't happened, and I was done pretending about things that were real and painful. We walked to First Methodist Church together, Mother and me, just like we'd done every Sunday for as long as I could remember. People were already gathering on the front steps, dressed in their best clothes and holding small bouquets from their own gardens. Mrs. Patterson was there with her white roses after all, having decided that maybe my original choice of yellow flowers wasn't appropriate for the circumstances. Sam Wheeler was standing near the back of the church when we arrived, wearing a clean shirt and tie that looked like he'd borrowed them from someone else. He nodded at me and Mother, not saying anything, but his presence meant more than all the flowers and well wishes from people who'd known me my whole life. Sam had helped save me when I needed saving most, and he'd done it for no other reason than that it was the right thing to do. The ceremony itself was exactly what John and I had planned, except for the obvious absence of my brother as best man. John's friend from the school, Mr. Peterson, had agreed to fill that role at the last minute. The vows we spoke were the traditional ones, but when I said the words for better or worse, in sickness and in health, I meant them in a way I probably wouldn't have understood before spending 3 days tied to a chair in a freezing cabin. Pastor Williams spoke about love being a choice we make every day, not just a feeling that comes and goes when life gets difficult. He said marriage was about building something together that's stronger than what either person could create alone. I found myself thinking about Henry during that part of the service, wondering if he'd ever understand the difference between loving someone and trying to control them. When John and I kissed after being pronounced husband and wife, I felt something shift inside me. Not healing exactly. The wounds from Henry's betrayal were still too fresh for that, but a sense of moving forward instead of staying trapped in what had been done to me. I was choosing my own life, making my own decisions about who I wanted to be and who I wanted to be with. The reception was held in the church fellowship hall, with tables covered in white cloths and decorated with flowers from everyone's gardens. Mother had made my favorite cake, yellow with chocolate frosting, and Mrs. Henderson from the church had prepared enough food to feed twice as many people as actually came. Sam Wheeler sat at a table near the back, looking slightly out of place among the church ladies and school teachers, but clearly trying to enjoy himself. When I went over to thank him for everything he'd done, he just shrugged and said he was glad it had worked out all right. He said he'd been thinking about me and wondering how I was doing, and he was pleased to see that I looked happy. I asked him to dance with me, which clearly surprised him. He said he wasn't much of a dancer, that he had 2 left feet and would probably step on my wedding dress. But I insisted, and we moved slowly around the small dance floor while the church pianist played the Tennessee Waltz. Sam was more graceful than he'd given himself credit for, and during those few minutes, I felt like I was dancing with an angel who'd appeared in coveralls when I needed a miracle most. Later that evening, after John and I had changed out of our wedding clothes and were sitting on the porch of our new apartment above the hardware store, I realized something important. The wedding hadn't erased what Henry had done to me, but it had proven that his actions couldn't control my future. I was still the same person who'd been excited about getting married a week earlier. I was still capable of love and trust and hope, even after learning how deeply those things could be wounded. I was Mrs. John Mitchell now, ready to build a life with a man who'd proven he would search for me when I was lost and wait for me when I needed time to heal. And that felt like victory over everything Henry had tried to steal from me. I'm sitting here in my home in Bozeman, Montana, at 81 years old, flipping through a worn photo album from 1963. There's a picture of me in my grandmother's ivory silk dress, standing next to John, both of us smiling despite everything. Looking at it now, I can still feel the weight of that week, the way Henry's betrayal cut deeper than the ropes that bound my wrists. It wasn't just the fear of those 3 days in that freezing cabin. It was realizing the brother I'd shared my whole life with was a stranger. I'd grown up believing family was a bond nothing could break. But Henry showed me that even the closest ties can unravel when love turns into something else, something possessive and cruel. I spent years wrestling with what he did. Part of me wanted to forgive him, to believe he was just lost, that maybe something in his mind broke after Dad died and never healed. But forgiveness doesn't mean pretending it didn't happen. I let go of the hate, but I kept my distance. Henry's choices cost him our family, and I had to learn that protecting myself didn't make me less loving. It made me stronger. Mom taught me that, sitting on my bed after it was all over, her hands still shaking from the fear of almost losing me. She said love without respect is just a cage, and I've carried those words ever since. What got me through wasn't just my own stubborn will, though I had plenty of that, or even Mom's fierce determination to find me. It was Sam Wheeler, that quiet mechanic who barely knew us but drove through those mountain roads like he was answering a call from God himself. He didn't have to help, didn't owe us a thing, but he saw Mom's desperation and chose to act. That's what stays with me most. How a man I'd passed 100 times on Main Street, never thinking twice about, became the reason I'm here today. Looking back, I see that week as a turning point. It showed me how fragile trust can be, but also how powerful it is to keep going, to choose hope even when you're staring at the worst parts of human nature. My faith got me through those nights in the cabin, whispering prayers while I worked at that rusty nail. Mom's courage brought her to my side when no one else believed I was in danger. And Sam's kindness, that simple act of stopping his truck, reminded me that goodness can come from places you'd never expect. That's what I hold on to now, all these years later. The knowledge that no matter how dark things get, there's always a light waiting, if you're brave enough to look for it. Click the bell, share this video, and drop a comment. Has someone unexpected ever changed your life? Let's keep these stories alive.